For our last presentation, we've got Megan Conway, and I'm so sorry, I forgot to introduce Leah McCarroll, who is also going to be co-presenting on the role and capacities of community foundations. So Megan and Leah, take it away.
Thanks, Kristen, and I'm just going to pull up my slide here. And I appreciated Paloma's presentation because it touches on lots of important themes related to change and adaptation, which I'm also going to talk about. So thank you, Kristen, and hi, everyone. So today's presentation is about research that's very much so in process related to the role of community foundations in identifying and responding to emergent change. So I'm presenting on behalf of others in my research team who include Leah McCarroll, who's also going to be joining today, as well as Dr. Alexander Williamson, who's from Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane. I think it's probably somewhere in the ballpark of 3:30 in the morning over there, as well as Dr. Susan Phillips. Some of what we're going to talk about in today's conversation, high level. And I just want to also acknowledge that this research has been supported by PhiLab, and it's, as I mentioned, in a very early stage. But broadly speaking, as a team of researchers, we had some core interests related to how community philanthropy and specifically community foundations identify, address, and mediate emergent change. So we see the importance of the spatial turn within philanthropic scholarship, and we believe that there's a value in understanding what's happening within place-based philanthropy, which by its very nature makes activities and philanthropic focus very local. We also saw there being an opportunity to think comparatively about some of the questions we were interested in. And we identified some significant gaps related to comparative research on community philanthropy, and specifically comparative research that centers more squarely on the Canadian experience. So in today's conversation, I'm going to talk through a very, very early stage conceptual model related to how community philanthropy and specifically community foundations might future-proof themselves. We're also interested in this notion of how community foundations can act as community leaders, or thinking through different models of community leadership, especially models of community leadership that may be more present within times of crisis, such as the one that we've been living through over the last 16 months. And we're curious about the capacities that community foundations need to play in operating as a consensus builder, as an advocate, as a convener, as a meaning maker, as a disruptor, or a connector, or a funder. So a little bit about the two countries that we're speaking about, or that I'm going to speak to. Many of you probably, although it feels like a distant memory now, but many of you probably remember that in the very, very late stages of 2019 and into early 2020, Australia had some of the most wide-ranging and devastating bushfires that it has seen ever. And that we saw lots of images on the television and elsewhere around massive amounts of wildlife loss, as well as major swaths of landscape that were burnt. Similarly, within the Canadian context, we've seen a very long experience related to COVID-19, and its impacts have been felt differentially in different types of communities and in different types of neighborhoods over the last 16 months. But if you think about Canada and Australia, they're two very common, they have common histories on many levels. So both are Commonwealth countries, and they have similar government systems and similar geographies. Australia has a population base of approximately 25 million, while Canada's is 37 million. And another comparative element is that both have pockets of urban centers around them, as well as huge swaths of rural landscape. So we felt that there was something there in terms of a comparative analysis to think through the experience in Canada and Australia. So specifically, we're interested in the role of community foundations in mediating place-based or emergent change. Rapid change destabilizes legitimacy and authority of community foundations. And we've seen over the last number of months, huge shifts in terms of the terrain related to what is considered status quo and what is considered quote unquote normal. So there's been a shift towards a recognition of a Black Lives Matter perspective and the importance of BIPOC voices being held more centrally in conversations, COVID-19 as I flagged, as well as the bushfires and floods in Australia. And both countries have had a resurgence or a upswing in terms of the rise of a community foundation movement. And so when we started to look at some of those comparative pieces, we decided we would focus more squarely on the role of community foundations as intermediaries, and specifically the peak bodies of those organizations. So the two questions we've been interested in so far are, what are the emergent challenges and opportunities facing community foundations? And in what ways are the peak bodies for community foundations in Canada and Australia able to identify and implement strategies to address rapid and emergent change? And I think one of the other things I just want to flag is that the research so far has been much more relational in terms of making some connections to those peak bodies, both in Canada and Australia, and also in terms of scoping out perceptions of change. There's very little research that actually looks at the role of intermediaries in addressing change, and specifically philanthropic intermediaries. So we've developed a rough framework for consideration, and at this point it's tentative and conceptual, but we're thinking through questions of, as many of us have experienced, the last year has focused all of us onto being very concentrated on hyperlocal questions and hyperlocal issues and the hyperlocal experience. So how is that emerging as a frame, especially in relation to opportunities to self-organize or to ground grassroots initiatives at a very minute and local scale? The other theme that we see emerging is that there's systems change happening both locally, nationally, and globally. So as I flagged, paradigms feel like they're shifting, and what status quo is also shifting at different scales. And that's also impacting or interacting with what's happening at the local. The other thing that has another major trend that we see as emerging is this notion of shifting funding streams. So there's different pockets of money being made available to communities in ways that has never happened before, and that those are being flown through national intermediaries in ways that are unique and unprecedented in many ways. The other question or dynamic we see is that there's a new emergent collaboration and aligning with other funders happening within the same local space. So there has been enhanced or required collaboration at the local level with philanthropic bodies. So in terms of the methodology, we have focused on peak bodies or intermediaries, Community Foundations of Canada, as well as Australia Community Philanthropy. One thing to note is that the size of those organizations is quite different. So while CFC has a number of staff and has a larger operation, it's important to note that Australia Community Philanthropy is much smaller and smaller in size. So maybe not smaller in its impact, but definitely a smaller operating size as well as operating budget. And both of those organizations play important leadership roles in network building, in strategy, in learning and development across their members. So they play important roles in terms of sharing knowledge and learning, convening important conversations, and weaving together partnerships with various funders or resource partners. In terms of the mission and mandate of CFC, they have 191 community foundations, and I'm pretty sure that grows almost at least monthly, it seems like, but they have a large representation of community foundations across Canada, and they see themselves as building a movement that connects community foundations for a just and sustainable future. And Australia Community Philanthropy supports a vibrant peer network of community philanthropy across Australia. And so some of what we've done so far is to have very preliminary conversation with senior leaders in each of those two organizations. What was interesting, and these were very informal conversations and really much more focused on relationship building, but what was interesting in those conversations was a consistency in terms of themes that emerged at both of those organizations. So one major theme that both organizations identified is the relevance or significance of national partnership building, which was becoming a key strategy for success. So that was definitely something that has happened within the Canadian context with the flow through money from the federal government on a number of fronts, from funding related to gender and women's issues, most notably the Emergency Support Fund, which has also been flown through Community Foundations of Canada, along with other national partners, And most recently, CFC has also been a delivery partner in terms of a Healthy Communities initiative. So definitely national funding partnerships is emerging as a key theme. Comparably in Australia, on a number of key fronts, there has been a national partnership to support funding to flow through to community foundations from the national body in an enhanced way that has not been as practiced in the past. That has raised a number of questions in terms of capacity and administration, and also in terms of resonance across the membership of community foundations. So big strategic investments are being made nationally, and then the question becomes, how resonant is that initiative with the diverse membership of community foundations? Another emergent theme from these conversations has been a shift in terms of a focus on inclusion and trust-based philanthropy, as well as an emergence of equity and diversity and inclusion perspectives as critical in terms of how community philanthropy must pivot to address some of these emerging trends that are happening within community. And I hesitate to use the word pivot because it seems like every time I do, someone just cringes at how overused that term has been over the last 16 months or something. But the other flag that I think I want to note is that vital signs and this notion of identifying sources of knowledge that are relevant to understanding what is happening within local communities is another common theme between both contexts. So the notion that both Australia and Canada are looking for sources of credible, reliable data and knowledge to support grant making initiatives, as well as their role as community leaders, is another theme that emerged in our conversations. So I'm going to hand the mic over to Leah, who's going to talk through some of the methods that we've used, as well as some of the data that's emerged in our very early and preliminary exploration so far.
Thanks, Megan. So as Megan said, we were in early stages and have been kind of more focused on relationship building, getting a view of the landscape, and getting a view of more of the comparative dimensions of the peak bodies in Canada and Australia. We've started to do a preliminary analysis of some content that will be supplemented by a more robust content analysis in the coming months. And so the purpose of this most recent content analysis was really trying to get a sense of whether or not the preliminary coding and categorization that we came up with was right, really reflected what's going on, at least at the surface from a social media perspective for these peak bodies. And so that coding breakdown will inform our more robust content analysis that we'll be conducting. So we decided for our content analysis to look back to September 9, 2019, so pre-pandemic, so that we could capture any emergent changes with respect to things like the bushfires and floods in Australia, and to try and get a sense of whether or not there was shifting discourse or a shift in the nature of the content that was being promoted via social media. In terms of data sources for our pending content analysis, we're looking at the websites of these peak bodies, blog posts, annual reports, publications, and then social media. So we focused in on Twitter for the moment. But as I'll mention, the degree to which the two peak bodies use Twitter differs. So that will obviously inform what other sources we look at. In terms of our coding, we wanted to get a sense of what are the key issues to which we would see community foundations and the peak bodies responding. So we came up with this categorization that includes public health, so anything related to community health, mental health, health crises, so of course the pandemic, climate and environment as another emerging, well, not emerging issue, but another issue to which community foundations must respond. So climate change, natural disasters, questions of sustainability, structural inequality, so equity, empowerment, enfranchisement, anti-oppression. We wanted to look at welfare, so homelessness, youth welfare, poverty, living wages, etc. And then any trends with respect to changing philanthropic demands. So specific to sector best practices, policy changes that would influence how philanthropic organizations respond, and specifically community foundations respond. What kinds of partnerships are showing up, so with business and government, and then other philanthropic organizations in the space. And then the final category is internal processes. So of course, just the regular kind of cycle of talking about grants, hiring, events, and publications that don't necessarily highlight a specific community issue, but rather keep audiences up to date on what's going on internally at the peak bodies and then at community foundations in turn. So when we were looking at our coding, and of course this will likely evolve as we go into a more robust content analysis, but we wanted to first get a sense of whether the content is talking about a local versus a national issue, and or international, of course, and how they conceptualize and define whether the issue is local or national. And then we wanted to look at the purpose of the post. And the reason for this is so that we can build a scale and kind of an engagement scale of whether community foundations in their posting about issues or changes are engaging in simple awareness raising or sharing of information, whether they're calling community foundations and their other audiences to action, or whether they're engaging in partnership building. And some could be a combination. They're not mutually exclusive categories necessarily, but we have already seen a lot of posts just based on our preliminary scanning that would fall into any of these three categories. So in terms of our preliminary findings, what we did was essentially took the Twitter posts from Canadian Community Foundations of Canada and Australian Community Philanthropy, just to do a preliminary analysis of what kinds of things they're talking about on their Twitter feed. I'll note that we do know that ACP isn't as active on Twitter. Of course, they do tweet, but the community foundations that they represent are more active on Facebook. So that's something we will likely explore in our content analysis. But this was really to give us a sense of what are the high level areas that community foundations or peak bodies are calling on community foundations to look at or respond to. So you can see that for CFC, structural inequality was the bulk of the tweets that were coming up since September 2019. Especially, we saw that number rise over the course of the summer and has seemed to be a pretty stable theme throughout tweets since last summer. And then we see for ACP, climate and the environment was kind of the dominant theme that was showing up in tweets. So anything related to the bushfires, that was obviously a very prominent area of focus for ACP, floods, as well as sustainability. We are also seeing that, of course, public health for CFC came in second in terms of the frequency. Okay, so we're rounding up to our 2 minutes. So in terms of the frequency, counter to ACP, where there's just a 2%, and that was really just talking about COVID and no other kind of issues related to health, such as mental health, community health, et cetera. So we just found this a compelling first step into guiding the rest of our analysis. Again, these are just some word clouds that were created from the Twitter feeds and show some of the key themes that came up in our preliminary findings. Of course, we recognize that in this research, we're assuming social media is a proxy for peak bodies' voice and strategic direction. So that will, of course, need to be complemented by our content analysis in the next steps. And that will happen through annual reports, publications, as well as likely future interviews to kind of corroborate what we're seeing. And maybe I'll pass it back to Megan.
Sure. And so we're really at the stage of needing to do more analysis, but also having more questions around the data and more observations. But we're curious about whether or not peak bodies, what the tension is between day-to-day business and crisis focus, and how the perception of change and the response or adaptation to change has required a shift in strategy related to those two ends or dimensions. We're curious also about how crises destabilize how philanthropic peak bodies operate, and if so, how, and what capacities do those peak bodies need to have in terms of response and recovery from a crisis or a disaster. And then how do philanthropic bodies redefine community or double down, or do they double down on this notion of traditional community leadership and community philanthropy roles? And then another emerging question we have is, given the diversity of members in both community foundations, how do philanthropic peak bodies mobilize around critical issues, and specifically what strategies do they use to build consensus and mobilize around a specific agenda?
Sorry, at your 20 minutes, if you could wrap up.
That's great. We're at the end, and that's essentially it for us. And those are some questions we have rather than more fulsome, concrete answers, but we're interested in continuing the exploration. Thanks, Kristen.